Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this webinar. We're excited you're here. We're joined by our friends at Renaissance. We'll be starting in just a moment. Feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the chat box, and feel free to think about questions that you'd like to submit in the Q&A. We'll be recording this webinar. You'll be given access to the recording in a follow-up. We encourage you to share the webinar with your friends and colleagues, and we hope you find it helpful. While people join the webinar, I'll just mention a few housekeeping notes. We encourage you to use the chat for any comments, and if you have specific questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A so we make sure that we address your question there. Like I mentioned, we'll be recording this, so feel free to share the webinar afterwards. If you're interested in a certificate of attendance for the webinar, we'll be sharing a post-webinar survey. We appreciate your feedback, so we encourage you to complete that, and you'll be sent a certificate of attendance. Okay. There's a few more people joining. Thanks everyone for joining us. Hey, today's webinar is Designed to Read, Supporting Foundational Literacy Development in Catholic Schools. And I will pass it off to Dr. Julie Vogel from Renaissance. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us today, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. Before we get started, I'd like everyone to please take a moment to prepare both your head and your heart for a short prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we come to you today asking for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this webinar. Help us to engage in meaningful discussion, allow us to grow closer as a group, and nurture the bonds of community. Fill us with your grace, Lord God, and continue to remind us that all that we do here today, all that we accomplish, is for the pursuit of truth, for the greater glory of you, and for the service of humanity. We ask these things in your name. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Just a few words about me today. I have spent my career, next slide please, I have spent my career in various aspects of education, and when I'm not obsessing over what's coming next in education or how I can contribute to helping kids learn, I love spending my time in creative ways, and right now that creative venture happens to be wood turning. So I thought you might want to know some interesting fact about me. On the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Renaissance. Your webinar today is sponsored by Renaissance, where our mission is to accelerate learning for all. We do this by providing assessment and practice solutions, along with the right data and connections to help you develop strong early readers. We currently serve more than 2/3 of U.S. Catholic schools, and we are a proud NCEA partner and have been for years. We invite you to contact us after today's webinar to learn more about our solutions for age 3 to grade 3 readers. It includes the MyIGDs and STAR assessments, as well as LaLilo and Mayan for daily practice and foundational skills development. Everyone in attendance today will receive a follow-up email with the links to access all the resources and the PowerPoint recording. That should be coming to you from Renaissance on Friday. You can also learn more by visiting renaissance.com/developing. So I would like to very quickly turn it over to our two presenters. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about each one of them. Dr. Jan Bryan, who is with us today, has 20 years of classroom and university teaching experience, and she is a regular presenter on formative assessment, literacy development, and teacher expertise. She is a contributor to the book, Literacy Reframed: How a Focus on Decoding Vocabulary and Background Knowledge Improves Reading Comprehension. And a fun fact about Dr. Bryan is that in her time away from work, her family is involved in equine therapy for veterans and first responders with PTSD. Additionally, today we have Dr. Scott McConnell. He is the Director of Assessment and Innovation at Renaissance and Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of Minnesota. He is also the founder of Early Learning Labs and the co-creator of MyIGDs for Preschool and STAR CBM Assessments, two of my favorite products that we have at Renaissance. A couple of fun facts about Dr. McConnell are, he is an avid surfer, and he believes that kindergarten students are old. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jan Bryan, who's going to start by gathering a bit of information about our participants today.
Sure, let's just level set here. We'll get to know you via this poll. So Jonathan, if you don't mind, go ahead and launching that poll. We want to find out your level of understanding about the science of reading so that we personalize this as much as is possible via Zoom. So what is your comfort level, your familiarity with the science of reading? Not familiar at all? That's fine. That's lovely. No misconceptions to correct. Familiar with the term, but not all of the concepts. You are in for a brilliant experience with Dr. Scott. Somewhat familiar with the term and the concepts. Wonderful, wonderful. We invite everyone to add their insights into chat, or very familiar with it. I will give you the mouse and we can get going and you can click. So if you'll go ahead and put your preference there, go ahead and do your click and we will see what our familiarity level is. Are we getting feedback? I'm not seeing many responses on my view. Jonathan, are we getting feedback here? And we will look and see. There we are. That makes perfect sense. Okay, this is good. Somewhat familiar with the term. Excellent. Not familiar. This is wonderful. A blank canvas is a gorgeous, beautiful thing. Familiar with the term, but not the concepts. Dr. Scott is going to take you through there step by step by step. Very familiar with the term. Thank you. We all need the help. We all need to share what we know. So thank you. Any other responses? If not, we can close the poll and move forward. And we can end the poll. Excellent. Excellent. All right, so let's move forward and see what we're talking about when we talk about the science of reading. I'm going to lean on the work of Stanislaus Dehaene for the very first few minutes of this section. He's a neuroscientist, he's French, and he studies around the world, and he's keenly interested in how the brain learns to read and how the brain learns to do mathematics. So there's two books that you might want to understand or read with Dr. Dehaene. One is called Number Sense, and in that book, you will discover that we were born mathematicians. The minute we are born, we know a little bit about quantity, so math is built into us. We have a preference for greater quantity, and humans tend to have a preference for the number 3. So those are just some interesting things Dehaene uncovers for us. But today we're going to focus on reading, and his book, Reading in the Brain, tells you exactly how humans learn to read from the brain perspective. So we're not going to talk about instruction here. We're not going to talk about strategy here. We're going to talk about neurons, neural pathways, and things being charged in the brain. This book is a brilliant read, and I will tell you, I've studied this intently. I needed to go to his YouTube video first to hear him explain the book. And then I went back on my second try and I understood the book. But it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. Now we're going to focus on reading and what it looks like in the brain. The title here is Designed to Read. If this were a math webinar, we would have said Born to Read. We are designed to learn to read. Everything at birth is in place, firing and ready to go. All you need is a human to speak to you so that you hear words and hear human voice, and you need things to see in your environment so that you can look at objects and hopefully hear a human speak and put that image together with the sound, and then you develop the meaning. So the critical difference here is that math, you're born ready to go. Reading, you are pre-wired to learn how to read, and that's where it gets so exciting. This is the phrase that I try to keep in my mind all of the time. Children need access to written words in their environment everywhere. The classrooms, the halls, the lunchroom, even daycare centers, everywhere. It needs to be a plethora of words everywhere children look. Because when a human looks at a written word, the same thing happens in every human. It is remarkable how reproducible this is human to human. So when you look at something, there's this small region in the lower left hemisphere of your brain that just lights up like a Christmas tree. Oh my gosh, there's a letter, there's a word. Your brain actually gets excited and starts firing because it gets to see letters and words. It happens with everyone at that same time. It's called the letter box. So if you hear one say the letter box, the technical term is visual word form center. That gets a little cumbersome. Letter box makes sense. Now, in this video, I'm going to encourage you to watch this as soon as you get the link on Friday. This is about a 2-minute video, and Dehane is showing you how the word, when the word is seen, the reader perceives it in that spot in the lower left hemisphere, the letter box, and the letter box, oh, it's a word. Wonder what it sounds like. Wonder what it means. Can I say that word? Can I say it instantly? What do I know about that word? It fires off every single time a human sees a word. And it's critical that we build that. Scott, I'm going to turn it back over to you and encourage everyone again to please go ahead. Please go ahead and download or look at that video. Again, it's just a couple of minutes. If you're like me, you're going to go back and look at it a few times because it happens so quickly. And it goes from that base of the brain, your letterbox, which is your visual center, through your meaning, through your oral language, and through your auditory system. It's fascinating to watch.
Thanks, Jan. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start by recognizing my vocabulary word for the day. I loved, Jan, that you talked about plethora. So we're on it now, aren't we?
Yes, if I projected it, your letterbox would be so excited.
So what I want to do is spend a few minutes talking about what the science of reading is all about. And before we do that, I want to connect it to the title for this webinar, the Design to Read. I'm talking to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Julie mentioned that I'm on the faculty at the University of Minnesota. And one of the sort of architectural gems of the university's campus is an art museum that was designed by Frank Gehry, a modern, very famous architect who I think is located in Los Angeles. It's a really stunning building. You'll see that in a minute, but it started with literally some sketches that Gehry made on placemats. There is the design, right? You can see an art museum in that, can't you? It looks like an art museum. Yeah, it's the design. The art museum looks like that. And so what we want to talk about is how you go from Dehane's sort of sketch, if you will, of how kids learn to read, the fundamental requirements or mechanisms that they have that are going to produce readers, and how we, if you will, sort of activate those mechanisms so that children become proficient in this thing that we think is important. So as I mentioned, we want to talk a little bit about what the science of reading is. I mentioned to a couple of colleagues the other day that Jan, when we first started talking about the science of reading, sort of its big deal attention 6, 8, 10 months ago, Jan nicely pointed out that it's not the science of reading, it's the sciences of reading. And I think that that's a really important and useful idea here, because the science of reading isn't a thing. It's actually instead what this definition describes as a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research that's come to us over the last 5 or more decades, and that tell us how proficient reading and writing develop, and give us some guidance about how to most effectively assess and teach, and therefore improve student outcomes. So it's this idea that there are facts, there's knowledge that we can activate in our own planning and our own work. The science of reading is like any other science, and I think that sciences have sort of 3 characteristics that I want to call out very quickly here. The first one is that the science of reading is standards-based. On the screen, you see 2 logos for organizations that are important in this sort of standards-based evaluation of educational research. The Institute of Education Sciences is a federal research branch of the federal government. And they have, as you probably know, the What Works Clearinghouse. The What Works Clearinghouse is basically a catalog of evidence-based practices in education. But to get that catalog, they've articulated what the standards will be to constitute evidence-based. What are the essential characteristics of an experimental study that demonstrate the effectiveness of a particular intervention? A similar organization, not governmental, is the National Center for Intensive Intervention. It's housed at the American Institutes of Research. NCII has focused both on assessment and intervention. And again, they have a set of, if you will, a rubric, a set of standards that they want to apply to any product that's available to educators so that educators can see, sort of like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, whether that particular product stands on a solid foundation of evidence-based practice or of evidence in science. Second characteristic of science, any science, and the science of reading is no exception, is that it's transparent, that what happens in the laboratory is revealed fully, that the results and the processes that produce the results are known to everyone who's interested in knowing that. And so one of the standards, for instance, in writing up research reports is that we describe very completely who participated, what we did, how we measured what we did, and we described fully all of the results of that. So much so that one of the standards, it's not oftentimes it's sort of exercised, but one of the standards is that if I've done a study and you have questions, you can ask for my data and I'll share with you my data so that you can see whether I was really sort of reporting accurately or not. So this notion of transparency, that it's not what Scott discovered, it's what Scott did and shared with other people that other people can agree with. So the second characteristic of a science and a science of reading is that it's transparent. And the third one, and perhaps the most challenging one, is that the science of reading, like any science, is dynamic. What we know changes. What we know generally grows, right? So we know more today than we did yesterday. But sometimes the way that science works, sometimes what we knew yesterday is refuted today, or might be colored or nuanced today. So that we had a fact, and now the fact is a little bit more edgy for us. And so that idea that the science of reading is growing, that it's dynamic, requires a certain degree of vigilance or diligence on our part, that we need to kind of keep track of what's going on in this science of reading. I'm not a big advocate for all of us becoming nothing but journal readers. We just spend all of our free time reading journals. It doesn't sound fun to me. It probably doesn't sound fun to you either. But we do need access to information about how these sort of new facts are emerging in the scientific discipline. There are a variety of ways to do that. In fact, I should mention Emily Hanford here. You're probably familiar with Emily's work. She's a reporter for American Public Media, and she's done a series of reports on the science of reading that I find incredibly helpful. She's a pretty balanced, pretty comprehensive reporter. And through listening to Emily, you can kind of get access into other places where a little more information about the science of reading might be available to you. So there are some benefits and some challenges of having a scientific foundation for what we do with kids in classrooms. And that asterisk is to point out that this is my benefits and challenges, my interpretation of benefits and challenges, so please take them with a grain of salt. The benefits, our knowledge base grows over time. We're learning stuff all the time. It's such a cool feature of any science. If you love learning, this is the place you want to be, because there are sort of new facts and new edges of facts all of the time. Secondly, things that were challenges get resolved. And to some extent, new ones sometimes emerge. This is, I think, particularly clear as we think about educational interventions for kids who speak languages other than English before they arrive at school, that we're thinking more and more and more about those kids, about what it means to be bilingual or biliterate and how to best serve those children when they arrive at school. We are discovering new things, and as we discover new things, we face new challenges. The third potential benefit is that organizations, like I mentioned, the What Works Clearinghouse or the National Center for Intensive Interventions, the National Council for Measurement in Education, Best Evidence in Education, a website at Johns Hopkins, all of those places serve as independent evaluators. We don't have to be sort of the moment-to-moment detailed evaluators of each research study. We can, to some extent, rely on these other organizations to tell us sort of what floats and probably what needs a little bit more improvement. So those are some benefits there. Oops. I lost my slide deck.
And Scott, we can still see it here.
Okay, good, but I can't see you. There we go. Hi, sorry about that.
Welcome
We
back.
were talking as we were preparing, believe it or not, we prepared about the little glitches that come up during Zoom presentations. And hopefully those of you that are joining us today are familiar with them and a little bit graceful in accepting my foibles in doing this. So some challenges. There's no single definition or accumulation of the science of reading. So Jan talked about DeHaan's book. There's a fellow at the University of Wisconsin named Mark Seidenberg that has a similar sort of scientific basis book. There are a bunch of books. None of them are the right book. All of them are books that describe things that are probably worth our attention. The second big challenge is that claims of alignment or adherence, I'm based on the science of reading, that those need to be checked, that this is clearly a case where the buyer needs to be aware. That for those of us that have been in education for a while, you'll probably remember the federal requirement for a scientifically based reading instruction program. Nobody really knew what that meant. It was sort of a vague term. And so in the context of vagueness, we need to be diligent and vigilant about how we evaluate the things that are being told to us. This science of reading, as I've said, is vast and interdisciplinary. One of the features of it is that over the last couple of decades, a number of academics and organizations have tried to summarize what we've discovered from the science of reading. On the slide here, you have 6 examples of those summaries from Marilyn Adams, who I guess 3 decades ago now published a book called Beginning to Read, Thinking and Learning About Print, up through the more recent work by the National Reading Panel and the National Early Literacy Panel. All of these available online, all of them readily available online. And if you're interested in sort of a deep dive, these are the places that would be useful places to start. What we want to try to do really quickly is to summarize those summaries. This slide, you'll get this when we share it with you on Friday, and you can dig into the details if you want. But mostly what I want you to notice here is that each of the summaries has a variety of sort of categories of skill. They define them a little bit differently, but what we've done in this table is to organize the categories of skill that are similar across these summaries. So the columns are the summaries, the rows are the ways in which the summaries basically agree with one another. There are 2 summaries that I think are particularly useful for our conversation today. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in just a moment. One is the simple view of reading, and the second one is Hollis Scarborough's rope. So the simple view of reading is just that, it's simple. And so they describe it as, I guess they knew about DeHaan and that mathematical brain thing, Jan. They describe it as a mathematical equation, that reading, that is being able to access and make sense of and then use the information that's presented to me in text. It has 2 major components, a decoding component and a comprehension component. They define decoding as reading isolated words quickly, accurately, and silently, or decoding graphic shapes into linguistic form. Very early on in my graduate training, I had to take a class on reading instruction. And one of the things we were required to do was to go down to the local elementary school and tutor struggling readers. The little boy that I tutored was a 2nd grader. He was having a little bit of trouble reading, but he was a 2nd grader. So he was just learning these sort of basic decoding skills. It's that point about decoding graphic shapes into linguistic form that became so clear to me in listening to him read. What would happen is that he would sound out a word. It was really hard for him to do. Sometimes I had to give him a little help or correction. He'd sound out that word, then he'd sound out the next word, then he'd sound out the 3rd word. By the time he got to the end of a 4 or 5 word sentence, he couldn't remember what the sentence was all about because he didn't have sort of the fluency to be able to articulate what those shapes meant as words so that he could hear it, so that he could hear what the story was all about. So it's clearly the case, at least for him, that decoding is the way that we turn the squiggles that you see on the screen into the words and sounds that we understand as speakers and talkers and listeners. But decoding isn't the only one. Comprehension is the other dimension. So comprehension, according to Goff and Hoover, is linguistic comprehension. It's being able to understand and use those words that you just read. It means the process by which, given lexical or word information, sentences and discourses can be interpreted and talked about, right? So now go back up to that green mathematical equation. Here's sort of the cool thing about the simple view of reading. Do you notice that it's a multiplication equation? And I'm not a mathematician, I'm a literacy guy, but I do remember that 0 times anything is 0. And so the idea here is that if decoding is non-present, or if comprehension is non-present, reading is effectively non-present as well. And that by extrapolation, as each of those improve, reading improves. As you have deficits or delays in one or the other, it's going to affect reading. So the idea here is that we have 2 developmental constructs, decoding and comprehension, both of them essential ingredients to reading. Similar, but a little bit different, a little bit more detailed, is a model that Hollis Scarborough offered at the beginning of the 21st century. And we call it Scarborough's rope. This is a graphic that I really like for a couple of different reasons. The first one is that it echoes that simple view of reading, that she has what she calls language comprehension. It's what Hoover and Goff called comprehension. And she has word recognition, what they called decoding. Same ideas, just slightly different terms. But what's good about Hollis's work is that she's broken it down into more specific elements within language comprehension and word recognition, so that we can start to think about what the components are that lead to each of those two big constructs of competence. The other thing I like about this is that it shows what we all understand to be a developmental process, that each of those skills starts out as separable, right? That we can teach letter sound correspondence separately, we can teach vocabulary separately, but over time they start to bring together, come together and strengthen one another and produce what she has at the end of this graphic as fluent reading, a tight band of a bunch of skills that all work in concert with one another. So I like this idea of being able to sort of separate it into pieces, but thinking necessarily about putting the pieces back into a whole. Jan, you're always good at adding some color to this. What do you want to say?
Well, first, I was going to congratulate you on foibles. So we have plethora and foible in this book. I just had a tremendous aha moment, Scott. I've always looked at the rope from the right to the left, and then following your very detailed description of it, seeing that these are all coming together at the same time to have that cohesive bit of understanding. So now I'm looking at it from a different perspective, even though all the arrows were pointing that way. But for me, I'm more drawn to this graphic because it represents all of the pieces that come together in order to understand a squiggle.
Yeah.
Or a word.
That's a great point. And in fact, I think one of the things I think of as you're talking is that as you look to the right side of the graphic where everything is bound together so tightly, I think that also sort of reflects the idea that what was a separable skill becomes dependent upon other skills. So Jan and Jean Kearns, her colleague in the educational advisory group within Renaissance, have done a lot of work on how kids learn content when they're encountering words that they've never seen before. But that requires at least two things, right? It requires being able to decode the word. So I can say, hey, I just learned this new word called plethora. So I need to be able to decode it. But then I also need to be able to use the linguistic context that it exists in so that I can come to understand it. So one looks like a word recognition skill. The other looks like a language comprehension skill. But together, they're the things that allow me to advance my own learning and scholarship. So I think that idea of integration as you move from left to right is another really, really sort of cool feature of this graphic. But let's go on. So the science of reading today, I want to propose 3 takeaways for you. The first one is that learning to read, that thing that happens before kids can just go down to the library and grab a book and have a blast with it. Learning to read is a pretty well-specified process that occurs over time and that benefits from both naturally occurring and intentionally arranged opportunities. When children arrive at school for the first time, almost all of them are already talking. They're talking incomplete sentences oftentimes. They have vocabularies that might be 3 to 5 to 10,000 words. They have learned that. And what's amazing about us as humans is that nobody taught us how to teach them that. There's just something about how we hang out together that gives kids the information and experiences that they need to become competent talkers. That's what I mean by naturally occurring. The intentional arrangement part is, for me at least, oftentimes letter sound correspondence. There's nothing intuitive about, look at that word science. Whoa, let's talk about that one for a second. How am I supposed to decode science? Somebody's going to have to help me with that the first time I encounter it, because otherwise it looks like skiancy. It's not skiancy, Scott, it's science. So that intentionality needs to be attached to the places where the information is not as intuitively obvious as it might be to children otherwise. And so the first one is that learning to read has both these naturally occurring and intentionally arranged opportunities. As I mentioned, there are 2 big skill sets that are necessary, but neither of them alone sufficient. One is decoding, and the second one is comprehension, and that we can embrace both naturally occurring and intentional arrangements to help kids acquire those 2 sets of skills. And then third, to ensure great outcomes for all kids, to produce what we would call educational equity, we recommend, and I think the science of reading, to the extent that we can say it is a thing, recommends that systematic and explicit instruction in both decoding and reading comprehension be provided to all kids. So I'm going to turn it back to Jan in just a second, but I want to come back to that idea of design for reading. So the science of reading is a vast and interdisciplinary body of knowledge. It has a lot of tools. It's a mess of tools. When you look at this stuff, if you did a Google search on science of reading, there'd be no connection between the first, the second, and the 55th thing that you'd see on the list. It's a pile of tools. But what you need is the right tools for the job. We think that those right tools are these: what to teach and how to focus, how to know that students are mastering those skills, how to adapt instruction to serve all children. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jan to start talking about how we grab those tools and apply them in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at the tools and how we can make them work for us. So Scott, I'm going to go ahead and talk a minute about standards, because we all talk standards. Standards are a progression of learning. They show you where you should be at the beginning of the year and where you should be at the end of the year. And they give you some signposts along the way, grade level to grade level. But as we look to that, we might need to step just a little bit deeper, go beyond the standards and look at the day-to-day learning. This is where Renaissance starts talking about a learning progression. We take standards and we break the standard into each individual skill required to master that standard. We even analyze it to the point that we need to know the academic language, like book and page and track and speak. And we need to know the content knowledge, like letter and word and syllable and jump, all of those type of language opportunities that we have to have. So what we do at Renaissance is look at day-to-day learning, and we do that with what we call Renaissance Core Progress Reading. We have one for math, but we're going to talk about reading today. When we create Core Progress, our goal was to create every skill that is taught in reading and put it in teachable order. That was a pretty hefty skill, and it took us a goal and took us years to get there. To do that, we had to first look at every standards set in the US, some across the pond. We had to look at what reading experts say. We had to look at every set of reading standards available in reading curricula. And from that, we were able to determine the teachable order from the earliest skill in pre-kindergarten or kindergarten to the most complex and the final skill you teach in 12th grade. So this is what we talk about when we talk about our learning progression. If you use STAR assessments, you don't know it, but the learning progression is constantly running in the background because it tests students and then adapts to their responses. If they know this one, the next step in teachable order would be this one. I wonder if they know it. If they don't know it, we need to look at the one previous to that teachable order to see if they know it. So we call the learning progression the backbone of STAR assessments. So as we look at that, we're just going to give you a sample of what this looks like when we take a standard set and play with it. I know that you are all across the United States, and I believe, Julie, we have people outside of the United States here today. But Scott and I are working in Tennessee this week and again next week, and out of a plethora of avoiding foibles for repeating content. So we're going to use the Tennessee standard set just as an example. I want you to apply the concept of the number of skills and how we learn to focus those. So in the reading standards in this particular set, there is a total of 966 skills from the first one in kindergarten until the last one in 12th grade. So Scott, that seems like a lot. How do we teach all of them? What we need to do is own our tools. Standard is a tool. Let's own that tool and use it to help me prioritize and focus on the most critical skills among those 966. A critical skill is one that is critical to mastering content at grade level. So if I'm looking at a kindergarten skill and it is critical, it is teaching me what I must master at kindergarten level. Additionally, that same skill impacts what's coming up because that critical skill is also a prerequisite for first grade. So we look at those two things. I'm looking at a skill that's critical for my work right now and also lays the foundation for first grade. But furthermore than that, it reflects the emphasis of the set of standards I am using. It helps me know that what I am teaching is what is expected of the standards. All right, so Scott, let's see how we can dig just a little bit deeper into here and play with this. Let's get an example. We're going to look again at this standard set. And as we look at those critical, impactful, reflective standards, those that were so important, we call focus skills. And this is where you can focus instruction strongly. So let me give you an example. We don't tell you throw away the other skills that are not focused. They're important, they play a role. But we are telling you in a time when we have to prioritize and dig deeper with some students, we can't teach 966 skills. We can manage a base of 408 plus the others that are absolutely required. So Scott, let's look at example of just a skill, just a plain old skill. If you'll click, this is kindergarten, it's foundational literacy, and it's print concepts, okay? Recognize and name upper and lowercase letters of the alphabet. That's important. Whether you see them in isolation or in text, that's a good skill. But its counterpart, the focus skill, does all that and more. Recognizing that spoken words are represented by written language in specific sequences of letters. In other words, if you put your energy and time into preparing for the focus skill, by default, you will have had to show them sequences of letters and making sure that they can master that, both in isolation and in text. So by focusing your energy and your resources here, you automatically cover the one that came before. You now have one preparation. You now have more time for that preparation and you can go much deeper. Scott, let's look at another one. I think I have a third grade one maybe. Let's look at third grade. Oh, we've got a poll question. I will tell you in the third grade, it is the same. Different skill, but the same concept. So let's look at our poll question here. How familiar are you with the Renaissance Focus Skills Resource Center? This is a good time for this poll question because we're going to talk about that in just a minute or two. So the Renaissance Focus Skills Center is a free open resource available to everyone. So are you familiar with it? Or is it new? Okay. All right, good. So we've got some people that can help their colleagues.
That blank canvas again for you, Jan.
Yeah, I love the blank canvas. I love that. So we have some who, 3 that can help. And then we have others that will learn. I'm not going to tell you it's easy to learn. Everything is easy after you navigate it once or twice. I'm going to tell you it's easy to navigate those first 2 times. When you go to renaissance.com, use this URL /focus-skills. When you go to that URL, you want to bookmark it. And there is an orange banner that says, see Focus Skills Research. If you need an explanation that goes deeper than I gave you earlier, click that. It's a 4-page document that tells you step by step how Renaissance said, yes, we are confident this skill is a focus skill. It also reviews what we just talked about. Every focus skill is fundamental to getting the job done at grade level. And it prepares students because they are prerequisites for the next year. And it reflects the set of standards that you are using. They are critical and must be taught. When you get to the Focus Skills Resource Center, I know that you are not universally bound to a state standard. This is organized, however, by states. The reading standards are remarkably similar, and you will find comfort and familiarity there. But one of your first decisions is to select a state. So once you have selected a state, you can pick reading or math. I suggest for the purposes of this webinar, we pick reading. And Scott, let's see what it looks like when we click reading or math. It's going to give me a graph that says, here's what reading looks like. Do you want to look at a grade level? Yes. So I click kindergarten, and it shows me the focus skills in kindergarten, the ones that are critical, impactful, and reflect the goals of the standard sets I am using. Now, if you'll look to your right, you see that in foundational literacy domain, there are 9 focus skills. There are 11 focus skills in phonological awareness. There are 2 in fluency, which I find surprising because fluency is so critical. They must be really strong skills. 5 in foundational literacy and vocabulary. So that gives you the number of skills. When you click on a domain, you will see that that domain opens up. And here is print concepts. So I still see that there are 9 focus skills in that domain. But do you see the number 43, 44, 45? That is the position in teachable order. Skill number 1 was the first thing that happened in pre-kindergarten or kindergarten. Skill number whatever, 1000, whatever, 966 is the last skill you ever teach. So if you look at the position, that is simply a proxy for difficulty. The higher the position, the more difficult the skill. So I encourage you to play, and I use the word play purposefully, play at the Focus Skills Resource Center. There is, Scott will go ahead and go to the next piece. There's no way for you, you do not need to sign up. You do not need to give your email. All you need to do is be willing to go there and play, and it will help you with that prioritization piece. Now, I'm going to give you some sneak information. So each one of us has to be very astute here. This is a secret, okay? You are the first ones outside of Renaissance to know about this. Shh, it's a secret. So we're going to keep it our secret for just a little bit more. We have done some additional research into all of the focus skills because we keep asking, where are children tripping up? Where is it that they're having struggles? And when we looked at the skills in teachable order, we expected a staircase. And we got a staircase, but ever so often, Scott, there was a huge jump. So we decided to look at this deeply. So what I'm showing you now is all skills in teachable order. If you look at this graph, you see blue dots and you see green dots, but you see an arc being made out of the blue dots. That is the expected teachable order. When students respond to star questions that are close to that blue line, we see this beautiful blue arc, and we know that our order is correct. But now let's take another look into that. Scott, let's look at all of the skills above what we call the trend line. The ones under that blue arch, that trend, are relatively easy. So we're not throwing those away. We just want to focus our energy here. We want to see those that are either at the trend line or above, because the higher above the trend line, the harder the skill for that student at that grade level. So Scott, let's further it, make it even more prioritized. Now, all you see are green stars. That's because we only want to look at focus skills that are extremely difficult. So now we're going to add the difficulty metric. And here we have our set of focus skills that are significantly above the trend line, which means they are disproportionately difficult for students to learn at that grade level. So this is what we're working on. We have a little bit of analysis left to do to know that we have it correct. We don't want to share anything until we know it is correct and has been validated. But Scott, let's take a quick peek. We're gonna, again, you didn't see this, correct? You didn't see this, you took a little nap, you took a little break. Thank you, Scott, hands up. All right, so here's an example of a kindergarten trip step. We're asking students to support, with prompting and support, identify and retell major events and stories, including beginning, middle, and end. That's extraordinarily difficult. It was far above the trend line. So it means it's hard. Scott, let's see why it's hard. It's because background knowledge plays a tremendous role here. if they've not been read to, if they've not had lots of experiences with sequencing, this is difficult. But why do we have to do it, Scott? Let's see, why do we have to do it? Because it's the foundation of reading and listening comprehension. So that is one in kindergarten. Let's look at a couple of others, and I'm not going to tell you why it's hard. I'm going to leave it with you to think for yourself why it's difficult. But here's one in second grade from Author's Purpose. Identify what the author wants to describe. Scott seems like it would need to be a better author. But what the author is trying to describe, or what question the author is asking. So you would ponder this. We won't take time to do it now, but you would ponder this one and say, why is this hard? What might be the missing pieces? And then, Scott, what is the foundation for what comes next? So those are the trip steps, and we can go ahead one more. And I will show you, when people see this graphic, they go, well, there's not very many. I don't know why you're making a big deal out of it. Wait, we don't want a whole lot. We want students to be within range of mastering step by step by step. We want that. We are glad that there are not more. I think there's 28 total in reading. I'm actually happy about this. Reading evolves step by step by step, but I also want to know along the way, where are the big stumbles, those big steps where my children are going, I have no idea what you're talking about. We need more analysis because there's no trick steps in 5th grade. I have taught 5th grade. It's difficult. So we need to do a little bit more in that. And Scott, let's just see what we have next. Again, hide your eyes. This is what we will make available to you. It will be at the Renaissance Focus Skills Resource Center. You scroll to the bottom. Math is already there for you to download. As soon as we get this verified and we're confident that what we're telling you is helpful, it will be there next to math. So it's a simple downloadable document. Share with everyone, get together as teacher teams, and plan for these extraordinarily difficult skills. So I don't know if you noticed, I'm pretty excited about the trip steps. I don't know if that came through.
Your level of excitement is generally pretty high, but this one is a little bit higher. I think it's true. So thanks, Jan. So we want to talk just a little bit too about best practices for growth, for how it is that we both promote and know that we're helping our students grow. And I've kind of broadly broken it into two sets of best practices. Here's the first one: assessment and differentiated groups. That to make this work in any school, the essential ingredients would be, first, an assessment system that's trustworthy, meaningful, and efficient. Secondly, an assessment system that provides for early identification of students who might need supplemental instruction. And then third, an assessment system that provides information about the effects of your instruction. This is a model that recently was published by the Florida Center for Reading Research and the Regional Education Lab, another one of those sort of aggregators of research knowledge and education. You can find it by, I think, simply Googling Florida Center for Reading Research, and I think this is called the assessment infographic, but you'll also have it when you get the slides on Friday. The point I wanted to make with this is that assessment, and this is something that I think we all know, at least practically, if not deeply, that assessment is a term that has a lot of different sort of examples or forms or functions to it. So we'll do both screening assessments for all of our kids, and then we'll do some diagnostic or progress monitoring assessment. I want to talk just a little bit about some of the about how we use that information. So I mentioned that seasonal screening is something that's very common, I think, in schools these days. And seasonal screening with empirical standards, that is a basis for saying kids are making adequate progress versus not making adequate progress. That's an essential sort of resource for us to identify children that are having difficulties early on, not waiting for kids to fail some sort of high stakes assessment at the end of a school year or at the end of several school years, but rather to know in fall, in winter, in spring, are my students making the progress that I expect them to make given that level of that time in their school experience. That allows me to start intervention when the needs are more modest, and where as a result, it's more easy for us to address those needs and help kids get back on path. The second part is differentiated intervention. And this is a graphic that perhaps you've seen in other instances. I just want to kind of unpack it a little bit and then apply it to assessment and differentiated intervention. The graphic on the left is equality. And what I want you to notice is that all of the figures that I think of them as children are standing on, and that one on the left, Julie, is obviously an old kindergartner. All of the kids are standing on the same size box. And because they're all standing on the same size box, but they differ in their height, only the child on the left can easily reach the apple. The child in the middle maybe can get there if she or he struggles. The child on the right, not even possible. They're just going to wait it out. That's what happens if we give everybody the same level of resources and support. The image on the right suggests what happens if we differentiate those resources and supports. That is that the children who need more, a bigger lift, if you will, they get the more lift. So instead of thinking about boxes and helping kids get apples, think about instruction and think about the instruction that we provide to all of our kids, and then the instruction that we need to provide to some of our children or a few of our children that help them reach those goals that we hold for everybody. It's that model, it's that idea that differentiated intervention will help all children, or the vast majority of children, achieve the goals that we hold for all of the kids in our classrooms. The third part of assessment is progress monitoring and data-based decision-making. So we know as educators that we've got crackerjack good ideas. Give me a second grader that's having trouble in school, sitting around, this will happen for all of us, I bet, sitting around the Thanksgiving table in a couple of weeks. Somebody is going to say, hey, I was talking to my cousin the other day and her daughter is really having some challenges in school, and they'll want us to give them some answers. And the truth is we can. We're skilled, we have good training, we have lots of experience, we have good colleagues and supports. So oftentimes we have really, really sharp and thoughtful ideas to respond to challenges like that. And what I like to say is that everybody has good ideas, but sometimes the good ideas are really a subset of the ideas. So what we also need is a way to separate out the good ideas from the ones that need a little bit of improvement so that we can actually accelerate learning for our kids. To do that, we need to be able to measure repeatedly over time students' performance compared to some sort of long-term goal. So I want to give you just a quick image of what that looks like. This happens to be a graph that's based on curriculum-based measurement and approach to assessment in education. But the idea, I think, is common and I hope fairly obvious. What we have here on the left-hand side is 3 assessments of an individual child. And that child, it's not on the graph, but that's not good enough. That's less than what I would want my child to be doing in the very beginning of the school year. So what happens is that I say, okay, I'm going to take the child's current level of performance, then I'm going to figure out where I want them to be on some sort of empirical basis usually by, in this case, the end of January. And I set that goal, the green blobby thing, the green star way out there to the right. And then I draw a line from where they are today to where I want them to be by the end of January. That line becomes my goal line. It becomes sort of my metric for assessing whether I'm providing good enough services. So I know that this child is not meeting the expectations that I hold for him or her. So I design my I'm a pretty good person at this intervention. And what I discover is it helps a little bit at first, but it doesn't help enough. So what you notice is that the child jumped up a little bit, but that their rate of progress isn't following the goal line. If I kept doing this intervention, they would not reach the green star by the end of January. In fact, they might not reach the green star ever. So I think, well, that was a good idea. That wasn't a good idea. So let's try a different one. Oh, this one's better. Right? So now what's happened is that in the second intervention, the second supplemental intervention, I'm providing services that initially get the child back on path. She's headed towards that star. She's going to make it. But there's a little bit of a sort of a fade away towards the end there. So the last one is I tried my last third good intervention, and this one is the winner. This one has the child progressing and actually exceeding the goal by the end of the period where I'm doing this assessment. So the idea here is twofold. One is that I want to differentiate intervention and I want to be able to provide intervention so that children can reach that long-term goal that gets them back on path towards proficiency in school. But the second one is that I want to have repeated assessments that allow me to notice whether the intervention or interventions that I'm providing are actually helping meet that objective or not. Just a really quick call out to the curriculum-based measurement. That fellow on the right there is a fellow named Stan Dino. Stan was a colleague of mine here at Minnesota. He invented curriculum-based measurement because he was teaching a bunch of second graders here at a school in Minneapolis, and he didn't know if he was teaching them well or not. So he wanted to have some really fast, simple way to know that his teaching was working. Through a long series of studies, both that he did and then a number of people around the country have done, he came up with these very simple procedures that typically in 1 minute give you this quick sort of, he described it as sort of like taking your temperature to see if you're sick or not, a quick little body check about how the child's reading or math skills are progressing. So it's a one-on-one assessment that provides reliable, valid, and very, very efficient and actionable information. That matters because kids don't get I'm an assessment guy, right? So take that remember that as I say, kids don't get smarter by testing. It's just not what makes them smarter. What makes them smarter is teaching. So the good assessments are the assessments that are going to help us teach kids that need to be taught and teaching them the things that they need to be taught. CBM is helpful because it's reliable, right? Because it gives me information, you or I could do it and we'll get the same results. It's trustworthy in that regard. And it has the advantage of me sitting across the table from the child and doing the assessment. So I get to see what they're up to as they're doing this work. It's evidence-based for both screening and progress monitoring. We have benchmarks. We have a product within Renaissance called Star CBM. There are others that have benchmarks for children for seasonal assessments and then standards for using those measures for progress monitoring over time. And it becomes a general outcome measure, regardless of the measure. Sometimes it's kids reading isolated words. Sometimes it's kids reading little short pieces of connected text. In both instances, it's a general outcome measure of both components of the simple view of reading, both decoding and comprehension. So that's assessment. Best practices for grade instruction. First, instruction that aligns with your goals. Your goals are going to be somewhat different from school to school to school, and certainly from grade to grade to grade. What are those goals, and how do you select your instructional programming so that it helps kids achieve those? That's sort of almost a no-brainer, but I think important enough that it's worth putting on a slide like this. Secondly, I think we want instruction that produces reliable results, that when kids come to our classrooms, they achieve the goals that we hold out for them, both through our core curriculum, that tier 1 intervention, but also through our supplemental services that we provide for kids that are not making the kind of progress that we'd expect. The third one, and I think this is one that we constantly are trying to figure out how to do better, is to make sure that instruction is feasible. That means that in part, it means that it's easy to implement, it's easy to understand, it's easy for a teacher and for the kids to know what to do. But it also means increasingly that schools have provided the kinds of supports around teachers that are essential: coaching, professional learning, PLCs, those kinds of things that help teachers do something more easily than what they were doing previously. And then last, instruction that's leveled for tiers, right? So so go back to my boxes and the equity versus equality graphic a minute ago, that what we want is to make sure that the intervention varies by the needs of the children. That doesn't mean that every kid gets their own instruction. It might mean that for a very, very few children, but it does mean that we're being thoughtful about the children that need, for instance, they've encountered a trip step and we need to have a small group instruction on that particular skill so that kids can master it and be ready for the things that come next. We have a variety of measures that I want to talk about really, really quickly that might help you in these regards. Julie mentioned at the outset that I came to Renaissance because I helped develop these measures called my IGDs. I really do think that preschool is the only grade level that matters, and the rest of you are just, messing around, I suppose. But my IGDs are a set of measures, like curriculum-based measures, that are designed to assess literacy and language development for preschool-age children, both in English and in Spanish. As kids move into the primary grades, those older kids, as they move into the kindergarten, the primary grades of kindergarten through second grade, we have assessments that fall into the STAR assessments category: STAR reading, STAR early literacy, STAR curriculum-based measurement. And then Lililo, a new practice product that's a computer-based program that gives kids access to foundational literacy skills, instruction, and practice. So it's just a really, really cool little program. I've loved learning more about it. Then as kids really move into the older grades, like third grade and 12th grade, where kids are reading to learn, where they're using all of the skills that they gained as preschoolers and as primary grade students to start to access the world around them in a much more independent way, in a much more forceful way. There, we want to continue our assessments with STAR reading and STAR math for that reason, but also give kids access to text where they can deepen their knowledge and develop their own interests through things like Accelerated Reader or MyOwn. So what does that all mean for leveled instruction? That we have tier 1 services that are for all kids, it's comprehensive, it's efficient, and it's evidence-based. Tier 2 allows us to work with some students and provide more intensive, more engaged in instruction. It's oftentimes standard. So for instance, Lililo might be something that you use for a first grader that's struggling a little bit in their acquisition of decoding skills, but it's what every first grader who's struggling with phonics skills gets. And then third, there should be in there, oh, I guess I want to tell you just a little bit about Lililo. I want to pay attention to time too. Oh, I noticed time, it's fast. Lililo, remember Jan gave you a homework assignment. Here's your other homework assignment. Go find out about Lililo and see if you think it's as cool as I do. And with that, I wonder if you have any questions and we have any answers.
Well, we do have a couple of questions, Scott
Good.
and Jan. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the one that was in the Q&A because I think it's a big question. And I think there's a variety of answers to this. So the question is, how often do we assess students? Is there, what's the best way to do that? How often?
I'm going to start, Jan, but you have to correct me when I'm wrong. I would say that as often as we need to. And so what I think that means is that a standard practice that I think is easily sort of supported and makes good sense is seasonal screening for all of our kids. So pretty soon after the beginning of the school year, sometime shortly after the Christmas break, and then sometime towards the sort of middle end of spring when there's still a little bit of instructional time left in the school year. All of the kids, a brief, fast assessment that says, are they on track? For those kids that are not on track, that's where we want to lean in quickly and provide early intervention. And so for those children, it may be that some additional diagnostic assessment is needed so that we know more specifically what the nature of needed instruction is. And then that progress monitoring, and that might happen weekly or maybe even more often than weekly, depending on the skill you're seeing and how often you expect it to grow. But I think that like differentiated instruction, we should think about differentiated assessment. Not all kids need to be measured all of the time. If we're doing a good job with our tier 1 services, we can be pretty confident that the vast majority of our kids are going to make progress from fall to winter, from winter to spring.
Scott, I agree 100% with you. It's when you have a need to know something about the students. I would just add that formative assessment piece that is ongoing in the classroom day by day, right? The more, the observation, we call it Gemba walk among the work. As students are reading, walk among and listen to them. As they're working on math, walk among and listen to them. And when you see a stumble along the way, correct it. That just in time, yeah.
Great. So we are all out of time today. So thank you so much. And if we could go to that very last slide, that would be really helpful. Before we go, we do want to invite everyone to contact us with any questions about Renaissance solutions for developing early readers that you may have. You can call us at the number you see on the screen, or you can send an email to educatordevelopment@renaissance.com. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you again at a future NCEA webinar. Peace and all good things from all of us at Renaissance. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us. A big thank you to our friends at Renaissance and everyone watching live and those who will be watching on demand. So this webinar was recorded, so feel free to share it afterwards or come back and review the content. There is a link to the webinar evaluation in the chat, and you'll see it once this webinar closes. So we encourage you to complete that if you're interested in a certificate of attendance for the webinar, and check out nca.org/webinars for upcoming and past webinars. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a blessed rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.